What are they booing about? I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, another episode 6, and we're really happy today to have a wonderful person on the show, Katie Loncke. Am I pronouncing your name correct?
Loncke rhymes with wonk or honk.
Oh, Katie Loncke. Okay, great.
Yeah, we're meeting in verbally instead of just in writing.
Yeah. And, of course, my co-host, David Forbes, over in good old Brooklyn. And lots been going on since our last podcast, so we got plenty to talk about. Yeah. So, Katie, why don't you just start out by saying a little about who you are, where you came from, some of your background,
Sure.
How you kind of evolved into Buddhist directions, and how you ended up at the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. I think that would be really important for us to kind of get a sense of.
Sure. Thanks so much, first of all, y'all, for having me. It's great to be here, and I listened to Funi's talk with y'all on a previous episode, and it was really great. So I'm honored and humbled. And yes, for me, I've been with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship as a co-director. Gosh, I think it'll be 5 years in April. And I am maybe an unlikely candidate to find myself as the head of a Buddhist organization. And yet it sort of also feels like there's a lot that's been fruitful that's happening. So my background is that I am the daughter of a black side of the family and a white and Jewish side of the family. On the Jewish side, refugees from Austria, Holocaust concentration camp survivors who came to the U.S. In 1949 and kind of assimilated into more mainstream white Christian Protestant culture in the U.S., like a particular part of my family, not all of it, but some. Mm-hmm. And kind of had a classic American dream story of coming from refugee status, not knowing the language, into becoming successful by certain standards and professionalized. And my mom was the head lawyer for Planned Parenthood of California for the latter part of her career. She's feminist, really instilled a lot of feminist values into me from a young age. My dad's side of the family comes through via the Caribbean. Loncke is a Dutch name, so our side was enslaved through the Dutch West Indies. I've never met a Loncke that I wasn't related to in my life so far. It's pretty unusual. And similar American dream kind of fairy tale thing of my dad grew up poor, was able to get some scholarships, and was the beneficiary of some of the first affirmative action programs in the country. He was going to school, so he went to Yale and under affirmative action in like the 50s, the mid 50s. Wow. And had cherry bombs thrown at him and stuff like that. It was like not necessarily an easy thing, but eventually became a judge in California, and at a time when it was still somewhat unusual for Black folks to be judges. So kind of on either side of my family, I have this background in social justice, and I also have, like, religiously and spiritually, I have sort of interesting influences that led me toward what I would say is a somewhat common experience for younger folks, secular folks around my age when I was growing up in California, which was I was basically an arrogant atheist. I was like, this religion stuff is bogus, doesn't make sense. It's for people who, are suffering a lot and might need something to believe in, particularly for Black Christianity. It didn't make sense to me to have like a colonizer religion. Although I saw, obviously people do really amazing things with it, and seeing how quickly assimilation can happen on the Jewish side of my family and assimilation towards dominant whiteness is kind of like, this doesn't make any sense to me. But I read a book by the Dalai Lama, by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in high school, called The Art of Happiness, in which he said, in Buddhism, we don't prefer our friends to anyone else. We love all beings, equally. And my reaction to this was like, well, clearly this person doesn't have any friends, because that's what a friend is. It's someone that you prefer to other people. Maybe he's really famous, so he doesn't really know like who actually wants to be his friend and who's just sucking up to him. I don't know. This is my high school age mentality. So all this is to say, roundabout way, I was a product of a skepticism, a sort of politicized skepticism that was very influenced by witnessing Christian fundamentalism, specifically in the U.S., white Christian fundamentalism being anti-gay, being anti-women, being anti-choice. My mom was battling a lot of that, as well as white supremacist Christianity and its impact on Black folks in the United States. So that's sort of what my perception of organized religion really was. And so it took me a while to sort of warm up to the idea of Dharma or Buddhism. And I think like a lot of people my age who come from this kind of secular, skeptic, arrogant atheist mentality, I was sort of drawn in by some sort of problematic versions of Dharma, which are like, oh, it's okay, it's not really religious, it's a philosophy, it's a set of spiritual beliefs, it's compatible with Western Enlightenment rationalism, and you don't have to be like a new age woo person in order to believe in Buddhism. And since then, thankfully, I've been educated a lot more and deeper in the sort of like devotional and mystical and aspects of Dharma and its indigenous histories, particularly in Asian diaspora. So I've been very thankful to a larger Sangha, kind of helping me get over myself and my arrogant atheism. So, sorry, that was probably much more than you thought.
Oh, no. Very
political and the spiritual really kind of going together for me personally.
So, how did you dip your foot into Buddhism? What was your beginning entry?
Yeah, well, right after kind of sneering at His Holiness the Dalai Lama's book, later decided to try to take a course in college on Indo-Tibetan Buddhisms, and I think I still wasn't really ready to admit to myself that I was seeking a spiritual path, a wisdom path, and so I kind of dipped my toe in really, really tentatively, and found it to be just much more dry and academic than I was looking for, even though I probably couldn't have admitted it to myself at the time. So then I kind of took a break, and after undergraduate college, I went to Harvard for undergrad, and so after 4 years of studying a lot of theory, I finally got back to reading fiction, and I worked at a bookstore and read a lot of fiction. And I remember reading these short stories by Alice Munro, the sort of feminist author of these beautiful, haunting short stories. And her characters would get older, but not necessarily any wiser, I noticed. They just kind of repeat the same dysfunctional patterns as time passed. And I was like, maybe wisdom isn't something that just automatically accrues like barnacles on the chin of a whale, like as you age. Maybe wisdom is something that you have to work at and try to make it happen. So that was what kind of pushed me towards checking out some of the Dharma centers in Cambridge. And I tried a Zen place, and I tried a Shambhala place, and I ended up at the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center, which just had an inexplicable quality in the kindness and pragmatism of the people who volunteered and worked there that just immediately drew me in. They had a nice library and an entire closet full of tea, and I found my like little heaven, and started attending Dharma talks and 6 a.m. sits every day. I just walk over there from my apartment, and it was a very, very white community, like predominantly white which kind of threw me off at first. But there was one of the first Dharma talks I went to was, I think his name was Charles Mumford. He's a sports coaching. George Mumford. George Mumford. Yeah.
I had the privilege to work with him a little bit. Yes.
Yeah, he was so lovely. And he was the first Dharma talk I ever saw, and I was like, okay, I can maybe do this. And it was, so for me, just anecdotally, seeing people of color in teaching roles was really important and helped me to kind of motivate to stick with the practice and keep learning.
Yeah, and so you now are co-director of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship in Oakland, and how did that come about? And maybe for our listeners that are not familiar with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, you maybe could say a few words about its mission and its basic orientation. It's been around quite a while now, hasn't it?
Yeah, almost 40 years. Yeah, it'll be coming up in 40 years. So, yeah, the origins of Buddhist Peace Fellowship are around the Vietnam War. In a Zen tradition, Robert Aitken Roshi and other contemporaries, Nelson Foster, Reverend Imamura, were some of the founding members who just felt that Dharma and the practice of addressing and alleviating suffering needed to come off the cushion and into the streets where people were demonstrating, trying to bring about an end to the Vietnam War, and also thinking in very revolutionary ways beyond that particular war as well. And over the years, Buddhist Peace Fellowship has really been a place where people who are trying to sort of Venn diagram their different selves, their different lives. So the political self, maybe the activist self, or the self that really feels kind of inexorably drawn to social justice movements. And then this Dharma self, which can sometimes really pull us in what feels like an opposite direction, towards more introspection, towards kind of removing ourselves from society. And so it's been a confusing calling, I think, for a lot of us who end up drawn to BPF. We feel so deeply these sides of ourselves, the side that wants to be kind of active in the world and really immersed, and then the side that has been touched by the truth of the Dhamma and sort of seeing the illusory and transient nature of everything that's going on. So it gives us a lot to wrestle with. That certainly is, how I first arrived at it. I was blogging at the time. I had a personal blog where I would explore. Okay, I was a very eager student. I was like, okay, I'm learning all this stuff about Dhamma, and I want to, ehipasiko, like, come see for yourself, try it out. So I want to go see if this actually applies to my life as a sort of activist and political person. And that's how the folks at BPF came to know me, was through my writings online. I've been published in a few different places, and was really kind of like gloves off, like wanting to really test, like, are these teachings really going to be helpful in dealing with the trauma and the systemic oppression, the really acute and brutal forms of state violence and patriarchy and misogynist oppression that I was sort of seeing, and that's what led me to BPF. And we haven't solved the problem, but we are a scrappy and heartful crew of people who are in love with these questions and with this Venn diagram. And kind of Dharma for us as lay people, for the most part, is just part of how we understand the whole nature and question of suffering in society.
Do you have a kind of a worldview about that? I mean, I'm kind of putting you on the spot. I mean, do you have a way of sort of talking about or describing or reconciling the relationship between the relative and the absolute world, or the inner and the outer, or the absolute and the relative? I mean, clearly it's a question for all of us, and we wrestle with it. But I just wondered if it's not really fair to ask you that question.
No, it's a great question. Well, I think my short answer is the both and, and the dialectic, right? Mm-hmm. And within the Buddhist teachings, the relative and the absolute. Mm-hmm. But also, I really love this poem by Jane Hirschfield called Tree, which starts out, it is foolish to let a young redwood grow next to a house. Even in this one lifetime, you will have to choose that great calm being, this clutter of soup pots and books. Already the first branch tips brush at the window. Mm. Softly, calmly, immensity taps at your life. Mm. So for me, that's it. It's just the question that I have to live with is like, oh, man. The clutter of soup pots and books. That's the organizing and the great calm being. How do we do both?
Well, it sounds like... Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's just a beautiful poem. Ron had a conference a year and a half ago, and we had Jane Hirschfield there. So
yeah, she opened the conference for us. It was beautiful. But what I'm hearing, Katie, is that BPF. I think it sounds like you're constantly kind of in a mode of learning, in the sense of holding that creative tension between the social justice activism side and the dharma side. But what strikes me about BPF, in contrast, let's say, to Western Buddhism or Western Buddhist centers, is you're really grounded in the relative world. I mean, you're really grounded in the interdependent side of the coin, which I think often gets overlooked. And I've heard the term spiritual bypassing, but I was toying with the idea of another term, political bypassing. And it seems like what you're countering is this as you said, there is this tension or this sort of a long historical tradition behind it that is one of somewhat of quietism on one extreme. So maybe that brings up a good time we could ask you what are some of the direct actions. Now, you don't like the word protest. You like the word direct. I think I read that somewhere.
Wow! I love. Yeah, let's get nerdy about it. I love it. So at BPF, I think we are interested in diversifying the tools for peace that are available to folks who are practitioners, and that folks feel are accessible and available and relatable. And so, I think of Dr. Martin Luther King, who said that those of us who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. Yeah. Right. And so in order to increase our effectiveness, both Don Haney, my co-director, and I have we've come up as organizers and activists. And so we really care to continually improve and re-examine strategies and ask ourselves what works. Which is kind of an interesting thing when it bumps up against Dharma, because we see a lot of prayer vigils and a lot of candlelight vigils and a lot of kind of the spiritual, almost metaphysical approach to social movements, which I don't in any way want to denigrate. I think that they're really, really important, but I also noticed that they kind of became almost their own habit, their own habit pattern, and people really didn't. At least as far as we were seeing, there wasn't even really a range of options. It was kind of like that's the only thing that Buddhists can do is walk and pray and sit. And so we're like, well, what if we just blockade some things? What if you just turn the meditation into a blockade? And that was one of the first actions that we really did as BPF, a direct action. Oh, so back to your question about what's the difference between a protest and an action. That's a great question for these times, because a protest, literally is registering dissent, right? It's just protesting what's going on, saying, I don't like it, I want it to be different. Right. And that's really important for galvanizing, movement energy. And yet, as we've seen, it's very easy to ignore for the most part, especially when you factor in questions of power, like corporate powers don't necessarily care if you like it or not. Sometimes the government doesn't care if you like it or not.
Right.
Like, okay, your protest is registered.
Or militarized police that
Yeah. And so we see these very tame, kind of defanged versions sometimes of what has been a really rich history in the U.S. and worldwide, obviously, of nonviolent, revolutionary, nonviolent direct action tactics that are leveraging particular pressure on a target through either non-cooperation or disruption in order to push for a change. And we call that compassionate confrontation from a BPF perspective. We want to both be really sharp and on point strategically and tactically in why we're doing what we're doing, and specifically what's our plan. And we learn from some of the most, some of our famous, our favorite, also sometimes famous, social movement friends and Greenpeace and the Ruckus Society and groups that have been really doing this direct action, nonviolent direct action work for a long time. So we want to get that. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Has that led to an increase in civil disobedience on your part?
Yeah. Well, so sorry.
No, that's it.
Okay. Yeah. So I was saying our first action was a meditation blockade where there were, I think, nine or 10 of us. It was actually interfaith, Buddhists and pagan and Christian friends, blockading the hotel doors of the Marriott Hotel in downtown Oakland that was hosting the weapons expo of a national police militarization training and sort of weapons sale called Urban Shield. And we sat in silence in front of the doors, blocking and frustrating some hotel patrons, and then had a number of sort of non-arrestable rules, maybe 50 people or so showing up for a rally, and there were folks drumming as well, monastic folks, and it was a really, really beautiful action. And that was part of a larger campaign that's ongoing and now gaining even more traction to eliminate Urban Shield, this police militarization training that's in the entire San Francisco Bay Area region. So really looking at, locally, what can we do? How can we get involved in a way that kind of ups the ante for local demilitarization efforts? And then other actions that BPFers have been involved in, we've been really involved in the Black Lives Matter kind of organizing it, particularly in the Bay Area, but also nationwide. We encourage all BPFers to check out racial justice movements in their area and to integrate in an intersectional way racial justice into everything that's happening, whether it's eco-dharma or gender justice or prison work. And so here we had a successful direct action, again, in an interfaith context where it was really beautifully organized. It was in waves of 14 people. So every couple days, a wave of 14 people would occupy the lobby of the courthouse to pressure the district attorney to drop the charges against this group known as the Black Friday 14. So this was an all-Black direct action that happened. Gosh, it was after the acquittal of the police officer who killed Mike Brown. So an all-Black direct action happened to stop the San Francisco BART trains from running, and the DA had dropped charges against all white activists who had participated in similar blockades in the Bay Area but had refused to drop the charges against this group of 14 Black organizers. So we were called in as part of an interfaith group to help pressure the district attorney, who did ultimately drop the charges, which was a beautiful victory. Mm-hmm. So it can feel very granular and kind of detailed and like, oh gosh, these are little campaigns that are happening all over the place. But I really feel like if there's one contribution that Buddhist Peace Fellowship can make, it's really supporting and encouraging those of us who do feel called to this intersection of social justice movements and Dhamma practice to kind of round out our practice, make it more holistic. On the direct action side, let's learn some more techniques and skills. Let's learn some more blockade skills, some de-escalation skills, even climbing and communications and banner dropping and all kinds of ways, that are beautiful, that a lot of groups are really deploying in the service of collective liberation movements right now. Like, we want Buddhists to be useful and supportive in those movements, whether you're a medic or a legal observer or all kinds of different roles. They don't have to be like you're locked down to a bulldozer or something like that. Although you could if you want to. But then on the other side, in our dharma practice too, like, how do we encourage folks to just sort of gently bring the real everyday questions of oppression and resistance and liberation into our inquiry and our practice and our deepening of dharma, and not see them as something separate.
Right.
Well, I'm dying to ask you what your experience was at Standing Rock, because I know that you sent a contingent out there, and could you share a little bit about what impact that had on you and what you saw what was going on there in terms of
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've continued to feel so grateful to the leaders at Standing Rock, and particularly youth, who really established this, I think, a kind of quintessential example of spiritually grounded direct action, nonviolent direct action. And I mean, also as a little bit of context, we have been watching, so Buddhist Peace Fellowship was invited to participate in celebrating the Pope Francis's encyclical themed around climate change and the importance of resisting the kind of continued ecocidal extractive economy that harms the earth and living beings. And we've been watching the Paris Accords and these conferences and just noticing the ways in which indigenous rights and indigenous power were often left out of that equation. And so this already kind of raised some red flags for us around, like, okay, the environmental movement, even the areas in which religious and environmental causes are united, still have this really important area of kind of omitting indigenous power and indigenous sovereignty. And so then it was really, really encouraging to see Standing Rock come up and echo the work of a lot of different indigenous organizing around the world. Thinking of Unistoten Action Camp up in Alberta, that also has been blocking pipelines by setting up lodges, places where people are living. So Standing Rock was not the first group to do this, but it was obviously, sort of a historic effort, and just seeing the ritual, the ways in which ritual and prayer and deeply grounding into indigenous culture really drove that effort and brought about so much sympathy and solidarity and support among people from across the spectrum all over the world. So it was just a huge honor to be there and to work with some of our friends in the Indigenous Peoples Power Project. I want to shout them out too, IP3, which combines a lot of these skills and trainings in nonviolent direct action, led by and for Indigenous people all over the place. And so they were able to kind of create the rules of engagement for nonviolent direct actions that really helped to kind of bridge the peaceful, prayerful approach with also, again, this compassionate confrontation and really trying to push and stake out area for defense of sacred sites and burial sites. So I was there with a few BPFers kind of scouting it out and seeing how things would go. And then we were able to partner with Tanisara, who's wonderful, an amazing teacher, Dharma teacher, who raised money for dwelling, like a Dharma dome tent that housed a number of our folks, and we sent a contingent of about 15 people from all over the country who converged in Standing Rock, mostly people of color, women, queer folks of color. And I think it's going to be something that deeply influences what we believe to be possible in the realm of spiritually infused nonviolent direct action and protection and resistance, protecting things that we love, not just being the oppositional, I hate state violence, I hate corporate power, all this stuff, but really, really grounding in love and protecting what is important.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful.
Yeah, I think that brings up, where we're at right now in terms of your sense of, let me back up. That there was one article one blog that you wrote was called "When Martin Luther King Rejected Obnoxious Peace," and I think you were alluding to that a little while ago. And I'd like to hear a little bit more what your thoughts are on that in terms of, there's even, it's almost ridiculous that there's this debate out there that Western Buddhists, need to kind of be neutral, and centers, they can't really take a stand, and so
especially lately.
Yeah. So I could see both sides of the argument. I haven't really thought it through yet, in depth, but just thinking if you have any thoughts on this broad theme of Buddhist engagement versus, some people are accusing, people that are into socially engaged Buddhism of lefties trying to take over Buddhism and make it partisan.
Right. Yeah, gosh, we could talk for another few hours about this. It's such a such a deep conversation.
But I think I'm sorry to interrupt, but it seems like you use the term compassionate confrontation, and can you connect the dots a little bit with the MLK article? And
I'll try. Right. So a couple things. I think Martin Luther King's legacy has been so sanitized, right?
Right.
And co-opted into an argument for not troubling the waters too much, not really fundamentally disturbing or transforming the status quo, even though that's what he was all about in his life. And I do think that it's a reality that those of us who want deep transformation, who aspire to a truly peaceful and just society, and again, Martin Luther King was emphatic that peace without justice is not true peace. So those of us who are kind of on that path, for better or worse, do need to reckon with the legacies of revolutions and how revolutions have often betrayed their own members. And there's a shadow of Stalinism that continues to kind of affect, maybe a little bit less my generation, but certainly generations before, who invested so much hope and sacrificed so much for a belief that there was some system that was possible beyond a brutal, competitive, exploitative one, and then were betrayed and sometimes murdered by their own leaders or people who they thought were their leaders. So I think that that's really real. And so when I talk about compassionate confrontation, I don't even really mean like don't hurt the feelings of white supremacists. Like maybe that's what some people are thinking of why it's important to be compassionate, and it's like, oh, don't offend anyone, or like don't hurt people's feelings, or don't be too inflammatory. And it's like, for me, it's like, no, it's a much deeper strategy than that, because I see how sometimes our rage and our anger and righteousness, even if it's well-founded against an opposition or a demonic system, as MLK might have put it, it can sometimes just leak into our own movements, right? And it makes us more judgmental towards ourselves, towards each other. It's kind of hypercritical, embodied movement culture that we have, and I think in some ways it's a really wise kind of pendulum swing around Stalinism, and people don't want a dogmatic, left telling them what to do. And they want something more compassionate.
So one of the dangers is what you're inferring here is using kind of a Buddhist framework is, getting fixed to certain views, some ideological views, which are sort of inhibiting, the sort of the broader form of compassion that's more inclusive, but at the same time, there's something else. There's something else at play at the same time.
Yeah, that's what I was hearing. Kind of an attachment. People get self-righteous and becomes
and the stories, the metaphors that the Buddha used about anger, have to do with kind of clinging to a hot coal, and the ways in which our anger can do a lot of internal damage. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think it really requires of us the bravery and the vulnerability and the honesty that a Dharma practice really invites, which is looking at our own experience deeply and not kind of turning even nonviolence or compassion or whatever you want to call it, not turning it into sort of another false idol or fixed view, assuming that we know exactly what it looks like at all times or how it feels, but inquiring into our own experience and being able to see the three truths and the possibility for liberation, even within our attempts to confront and maybe even overthrow or transform the systemic inequality, systemic injustice. And that's all, I'm so deeply grateful for not only Dhamma itself, but all of the communities that have kept it alive over thousands of years, that have passed it on. And I think that there's so much that we need to learn from various communities combining Buddhism and peace work or transformative social justice work in a lot of different ways. It doesn't always look like, blockades or confrontation in the way that we might think of kind of in the U.S. or especially influenced by this really dramatic good versus evil kind of Abrahamic tradition, right? Even those of us who might practice Buddhism or identify as Buddhist, but compassionate confrontation and deep transformation doesn't always have to look that way. And I think Thich Nhat Hanh's lineage and his whole legacy is also a really beautiful example of being able to build the alternative societies and the strong communities that we want to see thrive, which, again, dialectically influences with the water protectors and with protecting land and life and community. The more that you value and cherish and have deeply transformative spiritual experiences within your community and connected to land and connected to breath and connected to everything, then the more that you'll want to defend it against corporate and state violence.
Yes. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you maybe one more question, and it has to do with something I think is very timely. What is the program that you're offering now at BPF that's called Refuge and Resistance? What is that about?
Yeah. So that was a 4-week offering that we sort of offered for free after the election, and coming into the new year. People were really heightened and activated, and we were as well. And so we wanted to think about kind of starting off January and the year 2017, coming back to the three refuges of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and kind of sinking back into those as refuges and exploring them, but also from, as classic Buddhist Peace Fellowship with sort of a twist toward engagement and towards social action. So really examining it as a question, this is something we often do instead of prescribing or giving kind of handing down answers. We often like to look at the questions of, what does it mean to take refuge, to acknowledge and cherish the fragility and vulnerability inherent to this existence, this embodied lifetime, while also recommitting to resistance at a time when it's crucially needed, and more people are really awakening to the necessity of resistance. And so there were video offerings by Don Haney, my co-director, and Kate Johnson, who's a wonderful teacher based out of New York. And we had a few different articles also associated. They're all free on the Buddhist Peace Fellowship website. And then we had a national call to cap off the month where people got a chance to share and meet in small groups and kind of feel connected in community. We're not here, honestly, I don't think we have a huge investment in defining, what is authentic Buddhism? What's real Buddhism?
Right.
Is real Buddhism political? Is real Buddhism engaged? You're not a real Buddhist unless you're fighting Donald Trump or whatever. That's not, I think in reality, there are plenty of us who, for better or worse, just do find ourselves in this Venn diagram with this tree tapping at the window and our clutter of soup pots. And so it's purely selfish. We're let's get ourselves together and support one another and figure out how to make best use of this situation in which we're called to, towards exploring dharma and also towards engaging with the social suffering and environmental suffering of this lifetime.
Well, you're on the forefront, and I think the Buddhist Peace Fellowship is so important in the times we're in right now. And I wish that organization vitality and support. We're really impressed with the work you've been doing there.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And likewise, thank you for bringing the lively and also respectful and fruitful and rich conversations into this sphere. And I think now more than ever, we really need to not be afraid of debate and disagreement, but be able to do it in a way that really reaches out and feels invested in kindness and truth at the same time, rigor and warmth. So thank you for exemplifying and embodying that too.
You're welcome, and thank you so much. You really embodied exactly what you said, and I would think people would be wanting to join.
We'd love to welcome more people. We're trying to grow as fast as the demand is also rising, which is a challenge, but a good one to have. And if folks check out our website, www.bpf.org, you'll find, particularly in the events section, we now have openings for applications to our Block Build B Leadership Retreat, which will be happening the last weekend in June of this year in Northern California. And we have scholarships available. We're working on some childcare stuff. We really try to kind of build in the world we want to see in all of the programs that we do. So we try to make them, with a focus on accessibility and diversity and all that good stuff. So please apply. That would be wonderful. And then we are going to be having some more sort of webinars and digital offerings throughout the year. So if you want to subscribe to our e-newsletter, that'll be the best way to keep in touch with what we're doing. And especially since we've got folks in multiple nation states who have issues, especially right now with border crossing and all this stuff, it feels very important to be building community across borders. And the internet at this point is a lovely way to do that, although we'll also have to keep an eye out for how to stay creative in case some avenues get shut down or curtailed. But
Well, that's great. We certainly have enjoyed this interview, and I think our listeners will too. And we'll be able to post links to the Buddhist Peace Fellowship and some other articles you've written on our website, mindfulcranks.com. Thank you so much, Katie.
Oh, thank you. And if any listeners want to be directly in touch with me, my email is Katie, Katie, @bpf.org. So I'm always happy to chat if you have questions or if you want to follow up on anything I said that is completely wrong and you'd like to challenge, not holding to fixed views.
Okay, that's very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You've been listening to episode 6 of The Mindful Cranks with Katie Loncke, socially engaged Buddhist and activist and co-director of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship in Oakland, California. You can check out their website at www.buddhistpeacefellowship.org and go to our website, mindfulcranks.com, to view our show notes and find links to a number of Katie's articles. You can also visit us on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks again for listening to The Mindful Cranks.